Welcome to the New World Order Showcase Podcast. Your host, Jill Hart, the coach's Alchemist. Couldn't be more excited to have you join us today. On this podcast, we celebrate the champions of change, the up-and-coming life, health and transformational coaches who are fearlessly stepping forward to make a difference in the world. Get ready for inspiring stories, practical tips, and powerful moments that will motivate you to make a positive change in your life and those around you. We're happy to have you join us on this incredible journey as we dive into the world of life, health, and transformational coaches who are lighting up the path towards a better tomorrow.
Hi, and welcome to the New World Order Showcase podcast. Today we have with us Karen Robinson. She is a licensed therapist with 25 years of clinical experience, specializing in trauma recovery, anxiety, and depression. She provides holistic care to create transformation and healing for trauma survivors. She believes unhealed trauma limits everything, and she is also the host of Heal, Thrive, and Dream podcast herself. So welcome to the show, Karen. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you, Jill, so much for having me today.
So tell us your story. How'd you get started?
Sure. When I was young, I was raised in what I would describe as a dysfunctional home. That's a term us social workers tend to use when there's food insecurity, poverty, domestic violence, and child abuse. So it was pretty rough. And when I was about 12 years old, I did have a pretty serious suicide attempt. And my joke now, since I survived it, is it was either God who saved me or the no-name Tylenol. Because remember, we were too poor for the branded stuff. So I did survive the attempt. And a couple years later, I ran away from home. My aunt and uncle ended up becoming my guardians, and I did thrive under their care, was awarded a full scholarship to university, and then went on to get my master's degree soon after. And all the while, I knew if God wanted me around, that maybe there was a bigger purpose for my life. So that gave me a lot of hope. Thus, after a few rocky relationships, I'm married to a wonderful man. We have 3 children. I left the Department of Defense after 17 years working with them because of sexual harassment and just oppressive work conditions. I did have lots of wonderful leaders, but there was also some toxic leadership along my way. And I decided I wanted to practice my craft or my profession in the way that I knew would be best for my clients and myself. Thus, Heal, Thrive, Dream. That's a short version of my story.
So can I ask you, when you were working, what was the time frame that you were working with the Defense Department?
Sure.
Purely for personal reasons.
Yeah. I left, okay, well, I did 5 years in Okinawa, Japan as well. So that's part of the equation. So it was around 2004 to 2020-ish. Yeah.
Okay. So it was after the turn of the century. Doesn't that sound so weird to say?
Yeah. Yes.
I had affiliations with the military from most of my life, but it ended in around 95. So I was wondering about relationship or work environments were a lot different in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and into the early 2000s than they are today. It'd be dramatically different in terms of what is acceptable behavior between subordinates and authorities, and it just, I have stories. Let me tell you.
I am very positive that you do. Yeah, it was extremely difficult having a high ranking officer removed from duty in the 2000s, and back in those early days, I would guess that would be nearly impossible, no matter what they did, right? So, or what they
Yeah.
said or did or behaved. Yeah.
Their behavior was just like, really?
Yeah.
To women in general. I mean, it wasn't just like, and this is related to trauma because it's very traumatic when you're working for somebody who has absolutely no regard for you as a human being because you're female. And it's only because you're female. Just like, if I were a man, you would never say that to me, no matter whether I was a janitor. I mean, you just like, I don't know. It just it blows me away today to think back on some of the things that went on. I know firsthand in the workplace in this country or in the United
Yeah,
States.
I still see active duty, retirees, veterans, men and women, and I've heard lots of things as well, because even women who've left quite some time ago have memories that's truly impacted their lives. So yes, I get it. It was not easy being a woman in the federal government or working for the military or in the military.
Yeah, really, any of those things. Even in corporate America, just women only became like real citizens in the 70s. It was that long, and they were allowed to have jobs, but then they were still expected to do all of the stuff that women were expected to do. And it was kind of ridiculous. If you go back and watch some of the old movies, you can see it. It's really pretty blatant, especially in the movies for like the 80s, the late 70s and early 80s. Um,
Yeah.
and some of them were funny, but they're like, I can totally see why those were happening. Working Women was one of them that comes to mind, where they're just like, they've had it with their boss and they kidnap him.
I don't recommend that per se either.
Well, yeah, that's just not the way that you handle traumatic situations these
Yeah, because
days.
that just ends you up in jail and then you'll have jail traumas.
Yeah, jail trauma, it's just some kind of trauma. So, mainly what kind of trauma do you help people with? Is it just like the everyday everybody goes through trauma? Because, you can't escape childhood without some trauma involved. I think it's what shapes us as human beings, but there's capital T trauma and then there's like
Loyalties. Yeah.
little t trauma. So where do
Yes.
you help not on that
Yeah.
spectrum?
Well, the honest truth is I can work with any of that, but my specialty is complex trauma. So complex post-traumatic stress. That's when there's developmental trauma. So something more significant in childhood, like sex abuse, physical abuse, extreme emotional abuse, even bullying that goes too far. The symptoms for survivors are very, very similar, no matter what kind of trauma. But complex trauma usually means there's some sort of developmental trauma. And then as across the lifespan, as life goes on, there's more trauma, whether that's domestic violence situations, sexual assaults, harassment in the workplace, or it could be something like a medical procedure that went very wrong, a natural disaster, like when the earthquake and tsunamis happened in Japan. I work with people that were there, and that was pretty significant traumas as well. And of course, combat trauma is also pretty complex with the moral injuries that can happen. So the bottom line is I have worked with almost any kind of trauma that you can possibly conjure up. And I specialize and have the advanced certifications in working with folks with complex trauma.
So how would somebody, this is going to sound like a silly question probably, but how would somebody recognize that they have complex trauma going on in their life? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, sometimes people go through things that are traumatic in their lives and they think that they're okay. It's just like, we just will ignore it and make it all better. And then,
No, it's really not a silly question. And even though some of the symptoms can look similar depending on the different traumas, people are still different. And so there's like this whole list of symptoms that can happen, but not every person's going to have every symptom. But I think a good guideline is to be aware of is if your daily life is impacted, like you're really having trouble functioning. And also, if you have this desire to rely on a substance, that could be alcohol, drugs, food, or maybe you see an uptick in pornography, sex addiction, spending over, shopping too much, like if anything that's really disrupting your flow of life. And then things like sleep are usually impacted. When trauma first happened, it's extremely disruptive. And then as time goes on, if you are healing in a healthy manner, that should get better. If it isn't, that's another symptom that it's time to get more help if your sleep is really whacked out. Another way to tell if there's trauma impacting you is if it's impacting the relationships around you. So if you're showing up differently for your partner, children, if it's hard to maintain relationships with friends and coworkers, it's probably trauma that you're being impacted. Okay. So that's
and
just a few of the symptoms.
can it go away? I mean, can you just bury it and then at a later point in life, it come up
That
and
happens
cause you
all the time.
problems?
Yeah. And the reason is what some people do when they've had some trauma is they become workaholics. And that's one way to bury the trauma for a while. But usually something later in life will trigger and then everything comes piling out. That or it just gets it more intense over time, the symptoms, until people can't ignore it anymore. Or people are on the brink of divorce or there's the kids start cutting off their parents because of the toxic behavior. And so at those points, I see a lot of people later in life like, okay, I can't, something's wrong. I can't do this anymore. And so, yes, to your question.
So would it be the parent who's dealing with the trauma or the kid who's saying, no, I'm not having a relationship with you anymore because of the trauma?
Yeah, I've seen it happen both ways. It just sort of depends. I've also seen adults allow their parents to still bully them. Like I've had recently an adult that was 55 years old and whose parent was, in assisted living, still cursing them out, belittling them. And so I'm like, well, how is your parent doing this to you? And they're like, oh, well, I call them every day. And I'm like, have you thought about not calling them every day? Or have you thought about setting a boundary? And they're like, oh, I have to respect my parent. And I'm like, well, at this point, you're 55 years old. You also are worthy of respect. And so just doing some, reshaping how people think about being parented is one thing that I see. And then there are times where kids cut off their parents because of they're like, yeah, I don't have to take this anymore. And they split away. When parents cut off kids, I see that less frequently. And it could be for a wide range of issues. It could be that the parent has these expectations on their child that the child's not willing to do or have boundaries. So the parents are like, forget you. And there's usually some sort of
Mm.
addiction going on when that happens. And if the adult child doesn't want to support a gambling habit or some sort of substance, they're like, oh, there's no point in this relationship because they're so sick at this point. The
Mhm.
illness has truly taken over every aspect of their life. So it's heartbreaking when that happens.
Sad.
Yeah.
Does happen though. I love your comment that unhealed trauma limits everything. Expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. I think Unhealed trauma, especially when it's significant, limits everything, is more accurate. And what that means is it can show up in every area of your life. The list is too long. And in fact, I plan to write a series of books about this. Trauma can impact your parenting. It can impact your relationship with a partner. It impacts sex, can impact friendships, impact relationships with coworkers, leadership. Like some survivors cannot tolerate authority at all because of the abuse authority has done in the past. I already said that it impacts sleep. It can impact your appetite where you're eating too little or too much. It can impact your irritability, so your mood and your mood fluctuations. It can impact your hormonal health. It can impact every area of your physical body. So a lot of times trauma survivors end up with migraines, fibromyalgia, immune disorders, heart conditions, blood pressure, like everything from top of your bottom. And there's studies now that prove this. Like as a young therapist, I suspected this correlation between trauma and the impact on the physical body, but now research is very clear of this connection. Trauma can impact your spirituality, your faith, how you see God, whether you believe or not, um, your ability to trust others. It can impact the energy around you, right? Let's see, I'm on a roll here. It can impact your mental health. A lot of significant or severe mental health issues. When I used to work with folks that were diagnosed only with schizophrenia. This was in my early career. And when I worked with them, I learned that every single one of them had significant trauma. Like we're talking being
Oh, yeah.
stabbed or tied down to be brutally assaulted, like really horrific incidences. And I'm like, there has to be a connection between them having the severe diagnosis and their trauma. Emotional health, your ability to cry, or if you shut down and go numb, all that's impacted by trauma. Oh, let's see, spiritual relation. Yeah, I think that's a pretty, your
It's pretty
career,
significant. Yeah.
your ability to learn. Like my survivors either were dissociating in class and could not focus and get work done, or school was their everything. And they're like straight A perfectionistic people that struggle on that end of the house, like super anxious. So I think I have covered most
Can I
things.
ask you about the schizophrenia, just
Mhm.
for clarity for me? What it is that like split personalities? Could it
No,
present that way, or how does that look?
I think you're thinking of dissociative or dissociative identity
Identity
disorder,
disorder, right?
which
Yeah,
used
yeah.
to be called multiple personality disorder. And that's when survivors really shut down and take on other personas, like their little self that was injured comes out, or this big protector comes out. Like there's different
Mhm.
parts of us that come out because of the trauma. The schizophrenia, the easiest way to explain it is psychosis. Like you can have psychosis with other mental health issues, but with schizophrenia, it's pretty severe. Like it's hallucinations, auditory, visual, tactile, um, delusional thinking. So really not being grounded in reality, you know?
Mm.
And so there is a genetic component as well to schizophrenia. So it's complex. They still are studying the brain, but I do believe that trauma is one of the factors in it, just from my experience as well. And there's some research too as well.
It's really interesting. It's like I can see how DID happens to people who experience trauma, because it's just like I it just makes total sense that your brain is gonna try to protect different aspects of you, and different we all are we're all a variety of different personalities at any given time, but most of us, they kind of blend together, and we can rein them in, and it's not like now I'm presenting as something totally different than the identity that uh, that I
Yeah.
normally present to the world. um
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
I kind of.
DID in and of itself is pretty rare,
Mhm.
but it is real. Like I know when I was a young therapist, I doubted its validity. It just seems so extreme and out there, but I have witnessed it to small degrees and big degrees, just not very often. But I've been in the field a long time at this point.
So how do people find you if they wanted to work with you, and how do you work with them? Is it one-on-one, in groups? How does all that look?
Yeah, so I do work with people one-on-one, and I also have a group style that's like a membership model where I do some coaching on a different theme on trauma every month. I do it in baby doses so the clients aren't flooded and overwhelmed. And then after the coaching, it goes into a support group so they can use their collective wisdom to also empower and help each other. And it just feels very validating to them. Like one meeting, one woman mentioned that her sister cut off and how that cut her off and how hurtful that was. And then a couple other members were able to say that that happened to them too. And they just felt so validated and felt less alone because other survivors had that experience. So the group membership is my favorite thing. It's the most cost-effective thing to get into to work with me. I also do one-on-one. I do coaching intensives every month, free for the community. And I also host 3 summits a year now, which is pretty exciting.
It's really exciting. So, um, I guess I would ask, how would people want to work with you? What would they be experiencing that they could get immediate relief from by working with
Mhm.
you?
It's a great question, and it's hard to answer in a way because people are so different. Think the most important piece of therapy is having a therapist that's one, competent in trauma. It's amazing how many therapists out there who are not competent. The words trauma informed are, you know, very popular
Buzzwords.
nowadays. Yeah, buzzwords, thank you. And it just means that people had a couple classes, and that's great if it's a nurse or a dentist, but when it's your therapist, you really want them to be competent if you're struggling with symptoms of trauma. So that's one, having a trauma competent therapist. The next is you want to be with someone that really hears you and truly strives to understand what you've been through. So I've heard all kinds of stories of therapists not believing survivors or questioning, like, are you sure that's you remember that correctly? Like because of being trauma competent, I already know that memories are fragmented and that's logical for what's happened, right? And so I don't question people's memories. I go with how they feel. If they feel that something terrible has happened to them, then they don't remember all the details. That's okay. We still can proceed with the trauma work. Okay. So I think the feeling that most people experience when they first start with me is just a sense of relief that they finally have a home to kind of get some help with. It doesn't mean that they're going to be healed in a couple of weeks, but they are relieved to know that I'm going to be on the journey with them and that there's baby steps that we can take for their healing journey. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does. And I know that you offer journaling prompts. Is it a PDF for people to
Yeah,
maybe uh, kind of take the first steps towards trauma recovery?
sure. One of the things I see sometimes is people don't have hope in feeling better, having things changed. So I made a little tool. It's called the Hope Tool. And what it is the HOPE, there it stands for different journaling prompts that can kind of help you be reflective and teach you that there is hope. So, for example, P stands for purpose and passion. So it's just, help guiding you towards, what do you think your purpose is, or what could it be? And like, well, what are you passionate about? So it just helps survivors explore, and hopefully plant a little seed that there is hope to be had. So I do recommend that tool.
That's awesome. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes. So how long do people generally work with you?
Mhm. Because I specialize in complex trauma, it's a while. It's years, honestly. The shortest time where I can say that there's going to be some healing is 9 months, because it takes a few months for people to trust and feel comfortable enough to talk about really hard things. So after the couple months of trust building and building up their coping skills, we call that bottom up approach, then we can do the top down approaches of evidence-based trauma therapies. And since I've been trained in all the models or most of the models, I can, at that point, I know the client really well and what they're gonna respond to. And if they don't respond to, let's say if I do cognitive processing therapy and it feels too fast for them, I can pivot and do another type of therapy that might be a little more gentle. So it depends on the client and their ability to tolerate the trauma work. But 9 months seems to be the minimum for good trauma work.
Is it the minimum to start seeing results in their life?
No, see, that one's also hard to answer because it depends on how willing and able they're able to put the work and the effort in too. So if I have a client in front of me that's determined to feel better and wants insta results, I'll say, okay, let's do A, B, and C. If you do A, B, C, you are going to feel better, And so if they are able to do that, then yes, they're going to feel better sooner. But again, like,
So
it depends on how much trauma they've been through. Like some people have really, it's amazing they're still walking around. They've been through so much. Yeah.
do you see a lot of those people? I mean, do they end up working with you because they've been like hit rock bottom? I mean,
Yes.
I don't really
Yes.
understand how that would happen. It's like, do the
Yeah.
police recommend that you speak with them, or mental institutions?
All of that. I have one of my recent clients was arrested for assault. It was pretty minor in the assault category. Like she didn't actually hit someone, but she was in their face and was touching them with her finger. And so she was, even though she didn't hit that person, she was very ashamed about being arrested, and it was rock bottom for her. Other people, it's something to do with drugs or alcohol and being arrested. I mean, it can be several different things. It could be the partner says, if you don't get help, I'm divorcing you, kind of thing. I have one client who's a combat vet who also had early trauma. It took us over a year to process his little t's. And his little t's would be huge t's for someone else who didn't have little t's or had, an easier life. So, that's why I don't believe in cookie cutter treatment. I believe that each client I see gets a very thorough assessment where I really look at all the areas of their life and see where they've been impacted, and then coming up a plan together is how I like to do it.
That really sounds amazing. Like you actually transform their life because you help them with concrete, actionable things that they can do to move beyond the trauma and to cope with it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't have been able to do this work for so long if it wasn't so rewarding. There's really hard moments. I've heard some horrific things that I won't repeat on a podcast because it would traumatize listeners. But I've heard some things that have really caused me not to sleep at night, right? And so to know that people can get better is crazy powerful. And it's really my mission to help people who are ready to be helped. Like some people just aren't there yet, but if you're ready, that's my specialty.
Yeah, you can't change somebody for them. They have to want to change themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Karen, this has been an interesting conversation, and I would like to know what's the one thing you'd like the audience to take away from our discussion today?
That baby steps in your healing work. Pick a category or what I call a pillar of your life and think, what's one small step I could do to make this better or different? It could just be simply as picking up a journal and I call it brain dumping so that you're not carrying all this stuff in your head. Just brain dump. Get in the practice of that and see how much lighter that you feel. So it's
Yeah,
a
that
takeaway.
works incredibly well. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another empowering episode of the You World Order Showcase podcast. We hope you've enjoyed hearing from our incredible life, health, and transformational coaches who are making a profound impact on the world. Remember, change begins with you, and you have the power to transform your life and the lives of others. If you want to take that next step and unlock your true potential, visit thecoachesalchemist.com, where you can find the 3 ways we can help you for free to spin your talent into gold with clarity, a system, and a plan. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an inspiring episode. And if you enjoyed today's show, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach more people with our positive message. Stay connected with us on social media for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and upcoming guest announcements. You can find us on Facebook at the You World Order or simply visit thecoachesalchemist.com.